So, and I'm really delighted to get a chance to have them visit and be on our program. But let me start by saying thank you to all of you again for being here. We really appreciate your presence. I want to especially thank the sponsors, and their names are on these big signs. We really appreciate your help and support. Big round of applause, please. And some of you are here way back when we really had only one sponsor. But let me tell you, if we didn't have sponsors like you, you'd be eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch. So Brooke being the ever penny pincher that she is, but that's what's important about it. But today I have a really special pleasure. This panel, this idea of this little conversation was really Ken Hance's idea. He is a best storyteller in the world, and he remembers a lot of stuff. So he and Phil were chatting. He said, you know what, we ought to have a little panel sometime to talk about Reagan and just reminisce about the old times. And of course I said, that would be great. Because you have to understand that while Reagan has been having a revival, and the fact of the matter is we have an organization, TPPF, that's staffed, I would say the majority of our staffers love Ronald Reagan, revere him. But they were under 5 years old. They never knew him. And when Reagan was alive, they weren't even, some of them weren't even born when Ronald Reagan was in office. There were a few of us around, but still, at any rate, I think it's important to hear from folks who were there and worked with Reagan and also worked in Washington when things were a little bit different than they are now. So I jumped at the idea, and here we are. And it's my pleasure to introduce these two guys, these two old guys who are around at the Reagan Revolution. I'll start with Phil. Many of you know Phil already, right? He is a former Texas A&M economics professor for 11 years and then was elected to Congress in 1978. When he retired in 2002, he'd been in Congress, he'd been in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and he went to work for UBS. And then now he's working for Lone Star Global Acquisitions. And whenever he can, he gets the Wall Street Journal to publish one of his op-eds. So that's Phil, and he's come to these events before. Now, Ken Hance was also a pointy-headed professor, as a matter of fact. He was a law professor at Texas Tech for about 5 years before he was elected to the state senate here in Texas, served in the state senate for, 4 or 5 years, and then was elected to Congress in 1978, the same year that Phil was elected, and then served in Congress. And when he retired, he was on the Railroad Commission, served as chairman, and then Texas Tech got him to be chancellor at that university, and what amazing things he did. He's the longest serving chancellor of Texas Tech University, and he turned not only Texas Tech, but the whole city of Lubbock around, very frankly, and did amazing things there, not the least of which is raising $1.2 billion for their capital campaign, building a lot of programs. I like the fact they've got an Institute for Free Enterprise there at Texas Tech and an Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, or Western Studies, which is fabulous. And he said he got it funded by private money, so you can't have folks trying to tinker in academics, trying to, soften that issue. So he's really done wonderful things. He's now living in Austin with his lovely wife, Susie, who's we're glad to have here. Susie's a lawyer, too. Kent's with Hance Scarborough. So now when these two guys went to Washington, it was 1978. They came at the same time. They were both Democrats. They came in the middle of the Carter administration. Inflation was rampant. Unemployment rate was very high. Interest rates were high. Everybody talked about stagflation and malaise, like it's something you have to get used to. And by the end of the Carter administration, we had Americans that were being held hostage in Iran. You forgot about that, right? Reagan was elected in 1980. And these two Democrats, conservative Democrats from Texas, went to work They worked with other conservative Democrats in Congress. They were called the boll weevils, the cotton belt Democrats, as well as Republicans and the White House. Phil worked on the budget, and that became the Gramm-Latta budget. Kent worked on the tax cut, which became the largest tax cut ever in U.S. history and still has that record today. Their bosses, you remember their bosses at the time were Jim Wright and Tip O'Neill. I can't remember who was on the Senate side, but these bosses in the House didn't like what they did. They were very angry. I don't know what they did to Kent, but I remember seeing him in that time, and it looked like they had dipped him in boiling oil and whipped him about the head. They were really mean to him or something. With Phil, they kicked him off the budget committee. And Phil's response was, you know, I did what I told my constituents I was going to do, and you kicked me off the budget committee? Yeah, I quit. I'm going home, which is what he did. Went home, ran as a Republican, and was reelected against about 9 other guys who were running for that position. Tip O'Neill came to Texas, right? And went back as a Republican. And so that's Phil. I want you guys to come up. They're going to sit here, and they don't want a moderator. And I thought it might be fun to talk about kind of what it was like in Washington working as Democrats before Reagan, but I don't know. You might not have enough time. You guys do what you want to do, and then Brooke will come up and allow you to take a few questions.
Great.
Okay?
Great.
So think about questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, can everybody hear me? Is my mic working? If you can't hear me, it doesn't make any difference. Just pretend it's good. Well, let me start. Kent and I agreed that I would start by answering what was it like before Reagan. Well, things were bad in the country, and the political movement that was beginning to nominate and elect Ronald Reagan, we felt in Congress. And there'd been 5 conservative Democrats from Texas that elected in the year we were elected. We formed this organization called the Conservative Democrat Forum, I think.
Right.
But it quickly became the Boll Weevils. We quickly got involved in a lot of battles. The first really big battle was we defeated the debt ceiling. And then we forced the leadership of Congress to let us vote on an amendment tying the debt ceiling to a commitment to balance the budget. We wrote a budget. We offered it. It was defeated. But we were already forming the nucleus of the Reagan Revolution before Reagan came. And so that's what the world was like. What was it like with Jimmy Carter? I think both of us kind of felt Jimmy Carter was a sympathetic figure. I felt, got blamed for bad Democrat policies. Nobody that was beholding to the constituency he was beholding to could have dealt with the problems of America in 1979 and 1980. Now, it's true, he could have stood up to those constituencies. He didn't. But one of the things that I decided before Reagan came was that Democrats couldn't solve America's problems, that we could help Republicans solve them, but Democrats couldn't and wouldn't. So, Kent, why don't you start and talk about when Reagan came and about the man?
You know, before Reagan came, Jimmy Carter was a nice man. And what he did for Habitat for Humanity since then has been very good. And the other thing, the Camp David Accord, was really the only thing I can think back that he did that was successful and should be commended for. Other than that, I was a swing vote on establishing the Department of Education, and I was invited over to the White House to meet with him. And I went in and met with him in the Oval Office, just the two of us. And he made his pitch why we should have a Department of Education, separate agency. And two things happened at it. One, I voted against him on it. And two, I went home and I told my family, hell, if that got me president, I got a chance. You know, and he was a nice guy, but he was out of his league, and that it was ineptness, and I hate to say that. I think that one of the things, he was somewhat of a loose cannon, and you've seen whether it was Bill Clinton used him one time, and that was one time too many. And but he is a nice guy. Somebody told me, I said, well, he's not qualified. And they said, he's governor of Georgia. I said, well, hell, that's like being Fort Worth mayor. And the difference was the mayor of Fort Worth knew not to run. And but it was unusual, and there was a lot of despair. You know, interest rates were 17, 18%. You couldn't buy a house. And it was, everything they said was like, it's the end of the world. And Phil and I thought, if you'd let America go and let America do what America does best, we'll solve these problems. And that was kind of where it was at the time. And I do want to say one other thing. We're going to have a fun time and everything. And I get some credit for the tax cut, and I appreciate that. But I want to tell you this. It's not because he's one of my best friends. But it wouldn't have happened if Phil Gramm had not been there. And
I would say that's bullshit, except well,
it's not. You know, President Bush, when he was in 2001, I was asking, they were losing some votes, and I said, what about the boll weevils? He said, when you and Gramm left, the boll weevils died. He said, there are others, they voted with you, but no one was going to get out there and carry a bill against the Democrats. And there were a lot of retributions for it, and that was one part of it. Then Reagan came in, and I think this is important. We had the first vote 33 years ago, this time, was for Speaker. And Tip O'Neill was a very liberal Democrat, and Phil and I both voted for him. And now, the purist would say, well, that's crazy. And look, we wouldn't have been on Ways and Means Committee and Budget Committee if we had done a protest vote. You got to look at the big picture. Are you in it to win, or are you in it to make a speech? You're in it to win. And that's the approach we took. And by the end of January, the Reagan administration, they approached Phil before they approached me. And Phil, why don't you tell a little about when they approached you about the budget? Because the budget was coming up first. I was on the tax committee, Ways and Means, and that would come up later in about April, May, June, July. But the budget came up first, and everybody was kind of like, whoa. As Phil Gramm, he's going to go against the leadership.
Well, let me start with the day Ronald Reagan took the oath. It was an extraordinary day, as you remember, having held hostages for a year. Before his hand came off the Bible, the Iranians released the hostages. We had to dress up in these monkey suits, as we call them. You remember the striped pants and the tails?
Tucks and tails, that's what it's called.
Yeah.
It hadn't made it to College Station.
And so anyway, Hance and I were sitting next to each other. And I mention this because it's important. It suddenly struck me that all my life, that my beliefs had been totally out of fashion. That I had always held these beliefs that were held by a very small number of people. And miraculously, I was listening to a man who agreed with me on everything, and who was President of the United States of America. And I decided at that speech that no matter what, I was going to work with him to try to do the things he wanted to do. And let me tell you, looking back, this thing looks a lot simpler than it did then. The Democrats had 26 more seats in the House than the Republicans. And it looked iffy as hell that Ronald Reagan's program was ever going to see the light of day. So anyway, we wrote a budget. It was basically an update of the budget that we had written before Reagan came. We did it with David Stockman then. We did it with David Stockman later. And so I'll tell my first Reagan story and then turn it over to Kent. We passed the budget, but then we had to vote on the reconciliation bill, which made it in order to bring up the tax cut, so the tax cut couldn't be filibustered in the Senate, and it actually made the cuts. And these cuts weren't the kind of cuts that are debated today. We eliminated 3 Social Security benefits in one vote on one day. The adult student benefit, the death benefit, and the minimum benefit. So as we got close to that vote, Republicans started getting squishy. And so there were about 30 Republicans who said they couldn't vote for it. So Reagan called them all down to the White House and called me down there with them. And so he set them all down around the cabinet table and then asked me to step into his office. So I went into his office. And I tell this story because it tells you something about the sense of humor and the humanity of the man. So he said to me, "What do you think we ought to do?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, before you ask me my advice, you need to realize I've never done this before. You know, I've never done anything like this before." He said, "Well, you know, I've never done it before either. What makes you think I know any more than you know?" And so anyway, I told him, "Look, I'm willing to do whatever we need to do to get the job done, but if we start changing this thing, where do we stop?" And I was afraid we'd lose the high moral ground. So, final point, we went out, the president sat down, I sat down, and so he started on his right, and he said, "You know, I'm not here to give a speech. I wanted to hear what your concerns were." And so the first guy sitting there said something like, "You know, I'm for your program, but my constituents have got these problems." And it must have sounded good because by the time it got all the way back around to Reagan, about everybody in there had mentioned about their constituents. So Reagan sat there for what seemed like 5 minutes without saying a word. And then he said, "You know, I've been confused. I thought this was about country, not about constituency." And he got up and left. And the next day they called the roll, and not one of those 30 Republicans voted against his program. And it passed by 1 vote.
That's good.
That's a hell of a story.
I tell you, Reagan, you know, every time I see somebody, well, he's a movie star, he's smart. He understood people, and he knew who he was.
Yeah, that's right.
And members of the legislature, he knew how to govern. He knew how to cut deals, when to cut deals. And one of the great stories in my lifetime happened at the White House. When I was carrying the tax cut, Jimmy Baker called and said, "We want you to pick out 7 or 8 that are undecided, that are boll weevils. Bring them down here and meet with the president." So, and another time they let me take 17 to Camp David for the weekend. That's not bad. And so I got back. When they did that on Monday morning, Phil called me. He said, "You took those people to Camp David. Why didn't you take me?" I said, "You were already committed." He said, "Oh, hell, I'll never commit early to you again." But we go down, and two of the people in the room, two of the conservative Democrats took, was Billy Tozan, who later switched parties and became chairman of Commerce, Energy and Commerce, and John Breaux, who later served 16 years in the U.S. Senate from Louisiana. We get in, and Reagan makes about a 90-second pitch. And Breaux, he looked at Breaux and said, "Congressman, why don't you go with us on this? We need you. We need you." And Breaux was a guy that had more than one vote. You know, I've always said, no matter where you go, every congressman, every state representative, every state senator that represents you, they got one vote. The key is to find somebody that will have more than one vote. You know, that they'll be able to influence people. And John Breaux could do that. And so Breaux said, "Well, Mr. President, the sugar cane farmers in Louisiana, it's going to bust them if you lift those quotas on sugar imports." Didn't have anything to do with tax cut. Reagan was smart. What on earth does that matter compared to the largest tax cut in the history of the world? Did he say, "Well, I'm a purist. You got to agree with me 100% of the time, bro"? The president said, "I'll do it." I mean, it was just like that. Breaux said, "You got me." Tozan said, "You got me." Boy, we started picking them off left and right. So we got through. I don't think there were one or two who said, "Well, I'm still undecided." So we get ready to leave, and Baker said, "We want you to have a little press conference in the North Portico." It's okay. I go out there and make a speech. You know, we picked up some more votes. These people are with us. We're moving forward. This tax cut's going to be great for the country and all that. And I said, "Any question?" Sam Donaldson. Any of you remember Sam Donaldson, ABC? Meaner than a junkyard dog. He looked up at John Breaux and he said, "Congressman Breaux, why are you changing your position?" Breaux said, and if it asked me and I was Breaux, I would have said, "Because it's good for the country." Breaux said,
"Well, wait a minute now. You said to Breaux, didn't you sell your vote?"
Well, no, he said that later. He said,
all right, go ahead.
Don't help me. Gramm and I have been best of friends for a long time, and I love him like a brother. Anyway, he says, why did you change your vote?" And Breaux said, "Well, my sugar cane farmers are having problems, and if they lift the quotas on sugar imports, it's going to run my sugar cane farmers out of business. And the president just agreed not to lift the quotas, and I'm going to vote for the bill." And that's when Sam Donaldson said, "Congressman, did you sell your vote?" And Breaux said, "Nope, I just rented it out for a while." And when he said that, I said, "Well, hell, he's through. He will never win another election. His career is over." That shows you I didn't know much about Louisiana. In Louisiana, they were saying, "Isn't he smart? He didn't sell it. He just rented it out for a while." He not only went on to serve in the House some more, he served 18 years in the U.S. Senate and was really one of the most effective guys there. Real effective. But that was just a strange deal, and just seeing how Reagan. Now, one of the things Reagan did on the example you told me. Now, just stop and think. He brings all those Republicans in there that were squishy, and he had one Democrat, and he got them in there. And what did he do? He took the one Democrat, and y'all went in the Oval Office for a minute. What was he doing? You guys don't deal with me. I got some Democrats over here to deal with me. He was letting them know in a subtle way that, you know, you need to go with me. And I think that's very important. One other thing I want to say about Phil Gramm. We had a friend, a mutual friend, Wade Lawrence, that wanted us to meet. We were both running for Congress, and we went to the Super Bowl. Dallas was playing Denver, and that was in 1978.
We won that game.
And the Cowboys won. But anyway, we were at the Superdome. It was packed. Super Bowl. Gramm and I are next to each other. Tony Hill caught a touchdown pass and won the game near the end. The crowd went nuts. And Gramm grabbed me and he said, they'll be yelling for us this way when we balance the budget.
Well,
and he said that, and I looked at him and I went, uh-huh. And I knew right then that he was committed. And it's one of my favorite Gramm stories. But I mean, everybody in the stadium was thinking about that the Cowboys had won. He wanted to balance the budget at the Super Bowl. I love it.
Reagan asked us down to the house, to the White House for the first time, to sort of talk about the country and where we would go from the 18.5% interest rates and the double-digit inflation and the disaster. And so Kent and I were eager to get there. We didn't want to be late, so I rode with Kent. And we were first people there. We got there, 45 minutes before the meeting. So we pull up to the gate where you go into the little driveway in front of the White House with what's called a diplomatic entrance. So the guard said, well, you guys are real early. You park wherever you want to. We're going to park people around the circle, and you're first, so just park wherever you want to. So Kent drives right up and parks right in front of the diplomatic circle. Okay, I don't know what kind of car it was. It wasn't a Cadillac.
Is a Chevrolet Caprice.
So anyway, so we get out, we go in, hell, like we live there. And so we have the meeting. It's a great meeting. And as usual, Reagan listened more than he talked. And we come out, and so I go to my door, and Hance is on the other side of the car. So I thought for a minute that he was doing some kind of comic routine, dancing around. Everybody's coming out, cranking their car, driving off. Hell, Hance is on the other side of the car, hands in his pockets, looking down. And so finally, I walked around the car and I said, what the hell's going on? He said, I locked the keys in the car. Here we are, parked right in front of the White House. Other people are starting to come, old people leaving. And there we are with Kent Hance's keys locked in the car.
It was a deal. I said, Gramm, Phil, don't tell anybody. On that next Sunday in the Houston Chronicle, there was a little story in the headline said, not that he was excited, but he locked his keys in the car. And they reminded me of that for a while. It was a sinking feeling. I'd never done it before or since. And I reached in my pocket and there wasn't a key. And I'm thinking, how do I get out of this? Later, Stenholm asked me, so what's wrong with your car? And I said, it wouldn't start. He said, you didn't get in it. I said, I said, I could tell by looking at it that it wouldn't start. I was doing all I could to try to forget the embarrassment. One other thing I want to mention about President Reagan. We were working on the tax bill, and we were in the Jefferson room, right off the Oval Office. And we were in there, and Bob Dole and Jack Kemp were in there. Don Reagan, who was not my favorite person. Don Reagan thought he was a 4-star general, and everybody else in the world was a buck private. And I knew I'd catch up with him. And one day, he'd treated me that way, or Gramm that, different people. And I mean, he's just real condescending. He made a terrible mistake. He treated Nancy Reagan that way. And he hung up on her, and he later talked to Larry, to Deaver. Deaver said I'd call her back and apologize, and he called her back, and they got into it again and hung up again. And that was his last day at the White House. That happened about 3 years later. But we're in there writing the bill, And we got accelerated depreciation. We got 25% across the board. Now just stop and think. 25%. People are going to put that in their pocket. They're going to spend it. If you look back when Obama had his stimulus program, here's something they could have done. They could have gone for 5 months and not had any withholding for any of your employees. What would have happened? Well, the economy would have taken off. But here's a downside for them. Once you go back to withholding, people are going to say, how about let me just keep that money? But we were in the Jefferson room, and the president came in. He wasn't there. And we'd been negotiating for 2 hours, and one thing we got was to abolish the windfall profits tax on stripper wells. Later got it all abolished while you were there. And this is the most important thing I can tell you about President Reagan. He came in and he said, what's going on? And we're on Section 1325 that had to do with pharmaceutical tax breaks for companies that did business in Puerto Rico. And that was the one I was handling. And he said, what are you doing? And I explained that, and he just looked at me. He said, I don't know anything about that, and I don't want to know anything about that. He said, keep this in mind. Ronald Reagan wants to cut taxes, cut spending, cut regulations, and keep the communists off our back. If it fits in those categories, do it. If it doesn't, don't do it. Good to visit with you. Ronald Reagan knew who he was.
That's right.
He knew what he stood for. He knew how to govern. And he stayed focused. These little rabbits running around, he stayed focused on the big prize. And people say what they want to, but he was the best. I loved him.
Well, let me tell you 2 real quick stories. A real hero of this thing was a guy named Sam Hall. Y'all all know Ralph Hall, but Sam was sort of a John Wayne kind of guy. And he was a supporter of our whole program. He had been with us from the beginning.
He was a congressman from Marshall, Texas.
Exactly. And so what happened, and this now all seems so improbable and comical, but what happened is when this budget came out and the details of it, it was strong medicine. The country needed strong medicine. It was sure strong medicine. And so the night before it was introduced, Tip O'Neill decided he wasn't going to let me introduce it, that he was going to make the Republicans introduce it. So the paper, the actual bill, I had to give it to Delbert Latta from Ohio to introduce, and then Bob Michaels, the minority leader, was going to recognize me. Well, during that night, some Republicans made some changes in the bill, which the White House didn't know about, I didn't know about. And one of the changes they made was that the woman that was doing the legal work, they wrote her name and phone number, remember this, on a page of the bill so that it was going to become law. And so the whole day was just a nightmare of me trying to figure out what in the hell they had done and trying to figure out how to justify it. But it came down to the final vote, and it was tied. And there was one person, this vote went on and on and on.
They held it open
for an hour. One guy left, Sam Hall. And so anyway, the Democrats had ridiculed all these changes and how, you're going to make, got a woman's name in there with telephone number, God knows who she is. And they just had a wonderful time. And I was running around like a wild man trying to put out this fire, and then there's another fire. But So what happened is, so Tip O'Neill came down out of the chair to Sam Hall and said, Sam, this is an embarrassment to the House. Save us from this embarrassment. So I was standing right there. I didn't say a word. I figured worst thing I could do is act impolite to Tip O'Neill. But when Tip O'Neill turned around to go back to the chair, I said to Sam Hall, Sam, this isn't about Congress. This is about America. This bill's going to go to conference. We can fix these problems. And so he took his card and stuck it in that slot and pressed I. Took the card out, walked out the door. The Reagan program became law by one vote. One vote. The other story I want to tell relates to Reagan's humanity. Wendy had told a story about the Democrats took me off the budget committee. I couldn't figure out what the hell to do. I thought if I just changed parties, it'd look like I'd flown false colors. So one night, I was thinking, and suddenly it hit me, what happens if I resign? And what happens if you resign, you're in the House, is they have to hold a special election. So anyway, I decided to do it. I was going to resign, go home, resign, and then declare my candidacy as a Republican. Just tell people I had to choose between y'all and Tip O'Neill. I chose y'all. And so anyway, just as I was getting on the plane to go home, I called Lee Atwater. And I told him what I decided to do and why I decided to do it. As soon as I landed, hell, the president had desperately needed to talk to me. So anyway, Reagan said, Lee tells me you're going to resign. I don't understand it. He's all worried about it. What is this about? So I explained it to him. And so he said, you know, it sounds reasonable to me. He hung up. So Atwater, the minute he hangs up, Atwater, and I didn't know this until Charlie Black told me, Atwater starts screaming that he's got to call me back and tell me not to do it, that this is going to hurt Reagan, that I'm going to lose. And so Reagan, God bless his soul, said to Atwater, Lee, you know the whole world is not about us. The whole world's not about us. We're not so important that we ought to be able to tell people how they ought to make these kind of decisions. Now, how many politicians do you know that have that kind of humanity? But that was Ronald Reagan.
That was also part of his persona in that's the way he felt like in government, that people could make decisions for themselves better than government could. And so that carried over to his decision to think, well, you know, Gramm knows the district, and he kind of knows what's going on. You know, maybe feels right. And his humanity and just as a person, he did something for me. You know, there were Democrats. They weren't mad at us. They were livid. And I'd get on the elevator and you know, say hi, and certain ones wouldn't say hi back. You know. And then in the Ways and Means Committee, you had these very nice chairs on rollers. I go up there one morning and the rollers are going off my chair.
True.
I'm looking around and everybody else got rollers and I don't have rollers. So when the committee meeting's over, I'll send my staff members up there and put rollers back on. They found them, they put them back on. Next morning I go to committee meeting, I can't move. No rollers. And one day, I said in front of one of the staff members that was close to Chairman Rostenkowski, I'm glad they finally took those rollers off. I almost slipped and broke my neck last week on those things, and I'd had an order in to do it. They never took the rollers off after that. You know, I mean, it was just... Then the committee went to Baltimore to hold hearings. and you get on the bus, a short ride from Washington to Baltimore, and they had at the seats, it had with a label like for an envelope, it had your name. The first seat, Congress Chairman Dan Rostenkowski, D. Illinois. I'm going along, and I'm supposed to be between Burl Anthony and Pease. And I hadn't thought about Pease in a long time. He was to the left of Attila the
I remember when I do my taxes, because the PEP and Pease provision, it phase out your deduction.
Oh, I know. Anyway, sorry about that. We just had to talk about that for a second. And I look, and I'm not there. And one of the staff members, John Salmon, said, Congressman, you're back here. They put me across from the toilet on the back seat of the bus. I went back there and sat down.
Tell them about China.
But finally I said, Mr. Chairman, restroom's clean if you need to use it. I got it in good shape. And I just killed him with kindness. But in August, they announced the committee was going to China. And so we got the list. And all the Republicans had been approved to go with the committee to China. And all but one Democrat had been approved. So I'm back in Lubbock. And the phone rings. And it was about 7:30 Washington time, 6:30 Lubbock time. And I said, would you over for the president? Yep. And the Washington Post had a front page story. Rostenkowski plays for keeps. Hey, kick me off the trip. And Reagan called and apologized. Boy. And I get choked up thinking about it. And then he said, they didn't treat you right. And I said, well, I'm okay. My name's on the largest tax cut in the history of the country. And he laughed and he said, Chief Justice Berger is going to China next week. And I'm sending out a deal today. I'm appointing you as co-chairman of the United States delegation. And he did. And I went, and Deng Xiaoping met with us and refused to meet with the Ways and Means Committee. And the other thing Reagan would do, all during this fight, whether it's Phil or me or someone else, Marvin Leith or Stenholm or any of the guys, they'd call you and say, would you like to sit in the president's box at the Kennedy Center tonight? Yeah, I would. And would you like to bring somebody from your district to sit in the box? And he understood the process. The other thing he did that I thought was very smart, he got sworn in, and the next day he took the limo and drove down to the Capitol and had a photo op where he was going in Tip O'Neill's office. So everybody in America saw what? The president's down there with Tip O'Neill's office. He went down to him trying to work with him. He set the tone. And Ronald Reagan knew who he was. He knew how to govern. And he was one of the greatest, if not the greatest president. He changed the debate. Because before he got there, everybody talked about what are we going to spend. New. And since then, it's been a battle of where they're going to make cuts. He changed it. And he didn't get credit, but the Berlin Wall, that was Ronald Reagan. He busted the Russians. They tried to keep up with him.
Well, I've got to mention Marvin Leith, and I tell this story. It's very self-serving, but I'm articulate so seldom that the one time in my life I was articulate, I want to repeat the story. Kent was there. Reagan's been elected. It's clear that if we're going to win, that we've got to be involved from the beginning so that we can convince enough Democrats to vote for the bill. And so we've got to be involved in offering it. And we had discovered before Reagan came that about 10 of our so-called boll weevils were either spies for the leadership or they were eunuchs. And so we had a very, very tight number we had to meet. And I just didn't think there's any way in hell that we could do it unless a Democrat were out front. And so anyway, we have this meeting where I talk about offering this substitute for the Democrat budget. And Kent remembers the meeting because there was more whining and moaning and, oh my God, what is this going to mean? And the world's going to come to an end and it's going to destroy all of our careers. And so anyway, finally I said, I can see why if they'd had a debate at the Alamo instead of drawing the line, there never would have been any battle there. And so Jack Hightower, who was a wonderful, sweet man, dead, I'm sorry to say, but clearly one of the great eunuchs in history. He says, before you get carried away on the Alamo, you need to remember what happened to all the people who crossed the line. And so in one lucid moment in my life, I said, yeah, I remember what happened to them. They all died. But so did the people that didn't cross the line, only we don't remember their names. And so Marvin Leith, God rest his soul, jumped up and said, I don't give a good goddamn what anybody else in here does. Gramm is going to offer the substitute, and I'm going to vote for it. And then everybody jumped on, we offered it, and in the end, we were right. We won by one vote. One person voted differently, the Berlin Wall might still be standing. That's what difference it makes.
Phil was that was the key vote. That was the key vote.
That was the key
on
vote.
The tax bill, they had a pool at the White House on how many we'd win by. And I guess we'd win by 78. And we won by 78. I'd been in the Texas legislature. In the legislature, you count votes. And if you don't, you're going to get beat. And we started counting votes. And the thing that helped us the most, it looked like we didn't have enough votes. And Ronald Reagan went on TV. And he said in his speech, vote for the Honorable Hance bill. Mentioned my name. So it was a Democrat from Texas. Mentioned my name. And then he goes through the speech and he said, call your congressman and ask him to vote for the Honorable Hance bill. I got over 500 calls. It was my bill. I mean, when Reagan got on TV, he stirred them up. They were strong. But the next day, I saw Charlie Wilson. And Charlie Wilson, on military matters, was a good, solid patriot. In social matters, he wasn't on our side. But anyway, and Charlie was a playboy. And if you hadn't seen the movie, you ought to see it. And the movie showed him with a drink all the time and occasionally with a girl. I remember he was always with a girl and occasionally had a drink.
That's right. They had it back.
But he, I saw him, and I'm going to clean this up. Gramm hadn't cleaned all his stuff up today when he talked, but I want to clean this one up. I said, what do you think about the president's speech? And he said, and remember, I'm cleaning it up. He said, I hope he doesn't come out against sex. I knew right then he was getting a lot of phone calls. And they had tremendous, we got some people from Brooklyn, from, all over. But keep in mind.
Shut down the phone system.
Oh, it did. But here's the thing. Gramm had a tougher job because he was carrying budget cuts. I was carrying tax cuts. I don't care who it is. If you go up to them and say, I'm going to cut your taxes, are they going to hit you? No. They're going to grab you and pat you. I mean, they're going to love it. You start going, I'm going to cut your spending in this. And Russell Long said, people have a tendency to say, don't cut me and don't cut thee. Cut the guy behind the tree we can't see. and Russell, one last quick Russell Long story. Russell Long was one of the greatest of all time at hiding things in bills. And in that tax bill, we went through it, my staff, we went through it, Phil went through theirs. They started a rumor on yours that it abolished 4-H. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Gramm's bill abolishing 4-H. And I'm thinking, how does a budget bill abolish 4-H? I mean, they started every rumor you can imagine. And it was just tough. But what they were doing with Russell Long, we scrubbed it. We looked at it. And that bill passed, and about 4 months later, I get a call from Washington Post. And they said, in your tax bill, there had been provision, Don Pease, that you couldn't deduct 100%. If you took somebody to a football game, you couldn't deduct 100%. They were bringing it down. And that provision was in there. And they called me and they said, in that tax bill, there was an amendment. It was stuck in there at the last moment that said it exempted any university founded in Louisiana before 1925. You know, boy, I'm on that phone, I'm thinking, golly. And I mean, I didn't have to ask
Makes
what
sense
happened.
to me.
I knew what happened. And I said, let me get back with you. And he said, how long? I said, 2 years. And I knew, and the reporter laughed when I said that. And they got a hold of Russell Long and jumped him about it. And he said, who do I represent? I represent people in Louisiana. Once again, I learned a lot about Louisiana politics from John Brogan. But it was pretty funny. In closing, before we take questions and everything, I mean it. Gramm showed courage. Somebody said, well, you had to show. I did, but he went first. You know, you go on out there. And he goes out there and he makes it. But there were a lot of the Democrats did not like us, and there were a couple of them. I think they disliked you more than me, but there was one of them. They hated you for a while, and then they got where they hated me just as bad. But one you mentioned earlier didn't like you, but he really, really hated me. And we had to deal with that. It was just, and some of it was juvenile. You get on an elevator and say, hey, how you doing? How's those speech therapy lessons going?
Well, let me conclude. I got on the elevator during this period with the head of the Appropriations Committee. I don't remember.
David Obey.
Yeah. So he looked at me and said, you know what I hate about you people? He said, you act like it's your money. You act like it's your money. Final thing, and then we'll take questions. I want to tell I have a great final story about Ronald Reagan. I held a fundraiser in California when I was chairman of the Republican Senatorial Committee. Reagan had really cut back on the stuff he was doing, but he decided to do it. And so I went out back behind the building. He got out of his car and walked toward me. He had this quizzical look on his face. And I thought, hell, maybe he got his notes or something. And so he looked at me and says, you know, I don't remember your name, but I remember what you did. I said, well, my name's not important. What I did is important. I appreciate you remembering it. I didn't think any more about it. We went in, he gave that speech, and it was a great speech, didn't blow a single line. He got in that car and rode off, and a couple of months later, we got the word about he was sort of closing out the world because of Alzheimer's.
Before then, when they had the 10th anniversary of the tax bill and budget cuts in 1991, we went out to California. Phil and I went, and they had kind of a 10th birthday of celebration, and it was obvious to me he wasn't like he was, but he didn't know. I mean, when we were fighting those battles, he knew us, and I swapped stories with him, and he was great to swap stories with, but he didn't remember our names, and that was it sent a signal to us. Sad deal, but great American. A true patriot.
We remember his name.
Yeah, we remember his name, and everybody does.
Well, I will say that TPPF staff is having heart palpitations because I let y'all run 10 minutes over, but it is truly inspiring and humbling to be on the stage with the two of you in every way, because really you have changed, along with President Reagan, of course, leading the way, the course of the history of the world. And it's incredible to have you here. So thank you.
Thank you.